At 29, Evelyn Carter believed she had already survived the worst thing a family could do to you: erase you. She learned that lesson 10 years earlier, standing barefoot on a rain-soaked driveway, while her father watched from the doorway, arms crossed, as if he were waiting for a stranger to leave his property instead of his own daughter. He didn't shout that night. He didn't need to. All he said was, "Take your things and don't come back until you learn how to be useful." She never went back. So when Evelyn stepped into the sleek Manhattan law office a decade later, clutching a worn leather bag and wearing the calm face she'd taught herself to wear in hostile rooms, she expected indifference at worst. What she didn't expect was to see Richard Carter already seated at the polished conference table, perfectly tailored suit, relaxed posture, the confidence of a man who believed every room still belonged to him. He smiled when he saw her, not warmly, possessively. "Well," he said, voice smooth and low, "look who finally made it." The air in the room tightened. Evelyn stopped walking. This was supposed to be simple, a will reading. Her grandmother's final paperwork, signatures, condolences, closure. She'd taken an unpaid day off work and told herself she would walk in, listen quietly, and walk out with whatever memories she could salvage. She had not prepared for the man who disowned her at 19 to greet her like a business partner. Richard gestured to the chair across from him as if assigning her a place. "Sit," he said. "We have a lot to discuss." The lawyer cleared his throat, uncomfortable already. Evelyn didn't sit. She remained standing, hands steady at her sides, heart pounding in a way she refused to show. "I'm here to listen," she replied evenly, "not to discuss anything with you." For a split second, something dark flickered across Richard's eyes. Then it vanished, replaced by the practiced charm that had fooled investors, employees, and half the city for years. "Still dramatic," he chuckled. "Your grandmother would hate that." That did it. The name landed like a blade between her ribs. Her grandmother had been the only one who called Evelyn when her bank account hit zero, the only one who mailed her envelopes of cash labeled emergency money, the only one who ever said, "If they throw you away, I won't." Evelyn finally sat down, not because he told her to, but because she wanted a clear view of his face when the truth arrived. Around the table, other figures shifted. Vanessa Carter, immaculate and unreadable, checked her phone as if this were just another meeting. Margaret Hale, Richard's wife, sat stiffly at the far end, eyes fixed on the table, hands folded too tightly. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Eleanor Brooks," he announced. Richard leaned back in his chair, confidence radiating from him. He glanced at Evelyn and lowered his voice. "Don't worry," he murmured. "Whatever she left you, we'll handle it together. Family first." Evelyn felt something cold settle in her chest. 10 years ago, family had been the word used to lock her out. Now it was being used to pull her back in. As the lawyer reached for the first page, Evelyn realized this wasn't closure. This was the opening move of a war she never asked for, and one Richard was absolutely certain he was about to win. The sight of Richard Carter sitting across that table dragged Evelyn backward in time, to a night she had spent years trying not to remember too clearly. She was 19 then, soaked from the rain, her sneakers ruined, her hands shaking as she held a single suitcase and a black trash bag stuffed with the rest of her life. The driveway light had flickered above them, buzzing softly, while her father stood framed in the doorway like a judge delivering a sentence he'd rehearsed. "You want independence?" Richard had said calmly. "Here it is." There was no shouting, no tears from him, just a door that closed a few seconds later, cutting her off from warmth, safety, and the illusion that love in that house had ever been unconditional. Evelyn learned very quickly what being erased actually meant. It meant changing her phone number and still checking it at night, hoping it would ring. It meant sleeping on a friend's couch while pretending it was temporary. It meant working double shifts, smiling through exhaustion, and telling herself hunger was just another skill to master. What hurt most wasn't the struggle. It was the silence. 10 years without a birthday call. 10 years without a single question about whether she was alive. The only voice that never disappeared belonged to her grandmother. Eleanor Brooks called every Sunday like clockwork. She never asked why Richard had done what he did. She never demanded explanations. She simply listened. Sometimes she mailed Evelyn small envelopes with cash and handwritten notes that said things like, "Just in case," or "For groceries, not pride." When Evelyn tried to refuse, Eleanor laughed gently and said, "Let me take care of you in the ways he didn't." That was the difference. Eleanor never treated love like a transaction. Back in the law office, Evelyn folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. Across the table, Richard looked comfortable, as if the years between them hadn't existed, as if throwing her out had been a minor disagreement instead of a defining trauma. He spoke easily with the lawyer, nodded at familiar phrases, and smiled like a man who had never lost control of anything important. Evelyn studied his face and felt something unexpected rise beneath the old pain. Not fear, not hope, clarity. He hadn't changed. He had simply assumed time would do what intimidation once had. He believed she was still the same girl standing in the rain, desperate for approval. What Richard Carter didn't understand yet was this. The daughter he erased had learned how to survive without him, and survival had taught her something far more dangerous than obedience. It had taught her how to stand her ground when everything was at stake. The lawyer's voice cut cleanly through the tension, formal and steady, as if the air in the room weren't already thick with history. He began with the expected phrases: dates, legal language, confirmations of sound mind, words that usually slid past unnoticed. Evelyn listened anyway. She had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments were often disguised as boring ones. Richard barely paid attention at first. He leaned back in his chair, arms relaxed, one ankle resting casually over his knee. This was a performance he thought he understood. He'd built his life on contracts and leverage. Wills were just another document to be negotiated after the fact. Then the lawyer paused. "We now come to the primary asset," he said, adjusting his glasses. "The mountain lodge located on Cedar Ridge, currently appraised at approximately $1.4 million. The number landed like a weight on the table. Vanessa straightened immediately, her phone forgotten. Margaret's fingers tightened together. Richard's smile sharpened, subtle and satisfied, as if the room had finally arrived at the part he'd been waiting for. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. She knew the lodge was valuable, but hearing the figure out loud made it real in a way memories never had. That place wasn't just wood and land. It was the last space where she had felt chosen. The lawyer continued. "Eleanor Brooks writes, this property is the result of a lifetime of work, sacrifice, and clarity. It is also my apology to the granddaughter who never abandoned me." Evelyn swallowed hard. "I hereby grant full operational control and ownership of the Cedar Ridge Lodge to Evelyn Carter." For half a second, the room froze. Then Richard laughed, a short, confident sound. "That's fine," he said easily, waving a hand as if brushing away dust. "She means temporary control. Of course she does. Evelyn wouldn't even know where to start without guidance." The lawyer didn't look up. "There are conditions." Richard's laughter stopped. "Condition 1, the lawyer read. The lodge may not be sold, mortgaged, leased, or transferred in any form for a period of 5 years without the explicit written consent of Evelyn Carter. A muscle jumped in Richard's jaw. Condition 2, no family member, including Richard Carter or Vanessa Carter, may exercise managerial authority or make binding decisions regarding the lodge without Evelyn Carter's approval. Silence pressed in from all sides. Richard leaned forward slowly, eyes narrowing. "You're joking," he said. "My mother would never—" Condition 3, the lawyer continued, voice unwavering. "If any party contests this will or attempts to undermine Evelyn Carter's authority, Full ownership of the lodge will immediately transfer to a charitable foundation for displaced youth. Evelyn felt the room tilt. This wasn't generosity. This was a trap, precisely aimed, legally airtight, and designed to expose exactly who in the family valued power more than legacy. The meeting ended on paper, but the real confrontation began the moment they stepped into the hallway. The sterile white lights hummed overhead, reflecting off polished floors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old money. Conversations from nearby offices faded into background noise, as if the building itself understood this was not a place for witnesses. Evelyn had taken only 3 steps toward the elevator when Richard moved. He positioned himself directly in her path, smooth and deliberate, blocking her without touching her. It was a familiar tactic, one he had used countless times when she was younger, when authority alone had been enough to make her retreat. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Vanessa and Margaret slowed a few paces behind him, pretending not to listen while absorbing every word. Evelyn stopped, lifted her chin, and met her father's gaze. "Talk," she replied. "You already said everything that mattered 10 years ago." Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't be naive. That document doesn't make you powerful. It makes you vulnerable. You have no idea what it takes to run a property like that. Staffing, maintenance, taxes, investors. You'll burn through it in a year." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You don't have the capital. You don't have the network. And you certainly don't have the discipline." Evelyn felt the old instinct rise, the urge to explain herself, to justify her worth. She crushed it. "I survived without your capital," she said evenly. "I can survive without your approval." His jaw tightened. "Survival isn't success, and success isn't sentimental. Your grandmother was emotional at the end, confused. We can fix this before you embarrass yourself." Vanessa finally stepped forward. "Be reasonable," she added softly. "Sign a shared control agreement. Let Dad handle operations. You can keep the title. Everyone wins." Everyone except her. Evelyn glanced at Margaret. Her stepmother's eyes flickered, then dropped to the floor. Silence, heavy and practiced. Richard straightened, his patience thinning. "If you try to do this alone," he said, "you will fail. And when you do, you'll crawl back. I'm offering you dignity." Evelyn took a slow breath. "No," she said, "you're offering me a leash." That was when the mask finally slipped. "Careful," Richard hissed. "You think that charity clause scares me? I've crushed people with more leverage than you. This can get very ugly." Evelyn didn't step back. She looked him dead in the eye and answered quietly, "It already did. You just didn't notice when you were the one making it ugly." For the first time, Richard had no reply. As he turned away, Evelyn realized something terrifying and freeing at the same time. This was no longer about inheritance. It was a declaration of war, and he had just underestimated the one person he no longer controlled. Evelyn didn't drive to Cedar Ridge immediately. She sat in her car for nearly an hour after leaving the city, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching Manhattan's skyline recede in the rearview mirror. The buildings that once felt intimidating now looked distant, almost irrelevant. What waited ahead mattered more than anything behind her. The road narrowed as the city gave way to trees and quiet. Cell service faded. Streetlights disappeared. When the lodge finally emerged from the curve of the mountain road, Evelyn's chest tightened in a way she hadn't expected. Cedar Ridge stood exactly as it had in her memories. Weathered wood, wide porch, windows glowing faintly with the last light of day, solid, unapologetic. She parked and sat there, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. This place had been her grandmother's refuge, built board by board over decades, never rushed, never leveraged for appearances. Eleanor Brooks had believed land should be owned, not exploited. Standing there now, Evelyn felt the weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders, heavy but strangely grounding. She unlocked the door with the key the lawyer had handed her earlier. The click echoed louder than it should have. Inside, the air smelled like pine cleaner and old coffee, familiar and comforting. Dust motes drifted through the fading sunlight, and the wooden floors creaked softly beneath her steps, as if the lodge were acknowledging her presence. Evelyn set her bag down and walked slowly from room to room, the living area where families once gathered, the long dining table where her grandmother used to sit at the head, correcting posture and telling stories that always ended with laughter. Every object felt like a quiet witness. For the first time since the will reading, Evelyn allowed herself to sit. She lowered onto the edge of the couch and pressed her palms against her knees, breathing carefully. The silence wrapped around her, not empty, but full of memory, full of expectation. Tears came without warning, sliding down her face as the reality finally reached her. This wasn't just an inheritance, it was a promise. Evelyn stood and walked onto the porch. The valley stretched below, bathed in gold and shadow, the kind of view that made even large fears feel manageable. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, steady and warm. People don't come here to be impressed. They come here to remember who they are. Evelyn wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. Richard thought this place would break her. Instead, as the night settled over Cedar Ridge, Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not safety, not certainty, but something stronger. Belonging. Evelyn didn't sleep much that first night at Cedar Ridge. She lay awake listening to the wind move through the trees and the distant creak of the lodge settling into itself as if the building were breathing. By morning, exhaustion gave way to resolve. Fear had already had 10 years of her life. It wasn't getting this place too. She cleared the long dining table and turned it into a command center. Old brochures, handwritten guest notes, maintenance receipts, and faded photographs were spread out like puzzle pieces. This wasn't nostalgia, it was reconnaissance. If Richard planned to take this from her, she needed to understand exactly what she was defending. By noon, someone knocked on the door. Lucas Reed stepped inside, shaking rain from his jacket, carrying a laptop and 2 cups of coffee. He paused, taking in the controlled chaos of the table, the notes taped to the wall, the intensity in Evelyn's eyes. "So," he said lightly, "this is what it looks like when you decide not to run." Evelyn smiled for the first time that day. "Welcome to the war room." Lucas had been her friend since college, the one person who never asked why she didn't talk about her family. He set the coffee down and leaned over the table, scanning the papers. "Your father thinks emotionally," he said after a moment, "which means financially he's probably reckless." That was the first crack. Together, they began mapping everything out: operational costs, seasonal bookings, staffing needs, revenue potential that didn't involve selling the soul of the place. Evelyn explained her grandmother's philosophy: no debt, no rushed expansion, no partnerships that required surrendering control. Lucas nodded, already running numbers in his head. "This can work," he said finally. "Not fast, not flashy, but solid." Evelyn exhaled, tension loosening slightly. That's exactly what scares him. They worked through the afternoon, fueled by coffee and quiet determination. Every plan they built wasn't just about success. It was about creating something so structurally sound that Richard's usual pressure tactics would fail on impact. As evening approached, Lucas closed his laptop. "He's going to attack your credibility," he said. "Paint you as inexperienced, emotional, a risk." Evelyn nodded. "Let him." She walked to the corkboard and pinned up a final note in bold letters. Full rooms beat loud threats. Lucas watched her, thoughtful. "You know," he said, "most people would have folded back there, taken his offer." Evelyn met his gaze. Most people didn't survive being erased. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, Evelyn realized this was the moment everything shifted. The fight was no longer about inheritance. It was about proving that control wasn't the same thing as strength, and that the man who taught her fear had just taught her exactly how to defeat him. The first signs of trouble didn't come as threats. They came as silence. Evelyn noticed it at the small grocery store 10 miles down the mountain. Conversation stopped when she entered an aisle. Smiles tightened, then disappeared. The cashier, who used to ask about the weather at Cedar Ridge, suddenly focused very hard on scanning items without looking up. It was subtle, almost polite, which somehow made it worse. By the end of the week, the rumors reached her directly. A local contractor called to cancel a scheduled repair, apologizing too quickly. "It's nothing personal," he said. "Just, people are saying the lodge might not be stable. Legally, I mean." Another supplier delayed a delivery without explanation. An email arrived from a regional booking platform asking for additional verification regarding ownership. Evelyn sat at the dining table, phone in her hand, staring at the screen long after the call ended. Richard hadn't touched the lodge. He'd touched the narrative. By painting her as reckless, emotional, and unqualified, he was turning the town into a quiet jury. No accusations, no proof, just doubt. The kind that spreads faster than truth and costs far less to deploy. That night, Evelyn walked the grounds alone. The gravel crunched under her boots as she circled the building, checking locks she already knew were secure. Anger simmered beneath her ribs, sharp and focused. This was how Richard operated. He didn't destroy things directly. He made other people step back and watch them collapse. Lucas arrived the next morning with a grim expression. "He's been calling around," he said. "Old contacts, former partners, framing this as concern." "Concern for what?" Evelyn asked. "For his unstable daughter." The words stung more than she expected, not because she believed them, but because she recognized the strategy. Richard wasn't trying to win the lodge yet. He was isolating her. For the first time since arriving at Cedar Ridge, doubt crept in. What if the bookings dried up? What if the town turned completely? What if she proved him right? Evelyn gripped the porch railing, knuckles whitening, and forced herself to breathe. Fear had always been his favorite tool, but fear only worked when you ran from it. She turned back inside and opened the guest book her grandmother had kept for years. Page after page of handwritten notes spilled out. Gratitude, memories, promises to return. Real people, real experiences. Proof that Cedar Ridge had value no rumor could erase. Evelyn closed the book with steady hands. Richard was betting she'd fold under pressure. Instead, she began preparing for the moment when pressure would finally push him too far and expose exactly who was manipulating whom. Lucas didn't raise his voice when he told her. He didn't need to. The look on his face did all the work. "Your father isn't just angry," he said, sitting across from Evelyn at the dining table. His laptop was open, numbers glowing softly in the dim afternoon light. "He's exposed." Evelyn frowned. "Exposed how?" Lucas turned the screen toward her. Lines of data filled the page, corporate filings, loan records, shell companies layered just thin enough to pass at first glance. "I started tracing his recent activity after the rumors hit town," he continued. "He's been borrowing heavily, short-term loans, high interest, the kind people only take when they're desperate or overconfident." Evelyn leaned closer, her pulse quickening. "Borrowing against what?" Lucas hesitated for half a second. "Against assets he expected to control." The meaning settled in slowly, like cold water rising. Cedar Ridge. "He doesn't own it," Evelyn said. "He never did." "No," Lucas replied, "but he told lenders he would. He assumed the will could be pressured, contested, reshaped. He treated your grandmother's property like future collateral." Evelyn sat back, stunned. The pieces clicked into place. The confidence in Richard's smile, the ease with which he'd threatened her in the hallway, the way he'd spoken as if time itself would bend for him. He hadn't just expected to win, he had already spent the money. Lucas scrolled further. "If this drags out," he said, "those loans come due. And if he can't refinance using the lodge, he collapses," Evelyn finished quietly. "Yes." For the first time since the will reading, Evelyn felt the balance shift. Richard wasn't the immovable force he pretended to be. He was a man sprinting ahead of consequences, hoping fear would clear the path before him. But this also makes you a target, Lucas added. If he loses control of the narrative, he loses leverage. That's when people like him escalate. Evelyn stared at the screen, then out the window toward the ridge. The lodge stood unchanged, patient, unaware of the numbers being gambled in its name. So he's not fighting for family, she said. He's fighting to keep his debts from catching up. Lucas nodded. And that makes him dangerous. Evelyn closed the laptop slowly. Her hands were steady now. The fear that had followed her for weeks had sharpened into something else. Clarity, edged with resolve. Richard had built his attack on the assumption that she would panic first. Instead, Evelyn had just discovered the truth he couldn't afford to let anyone see. And somewhere deep down, she knew this wasn't just a weakness. It was the fuse to everything that was about to explode. The official notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath the lodge's front door like a quiet threat. Evelyn almost missed it. She was carrying fresh linens upstairs when the edge of the envelope caught her eye, stark white against the dark wood floor. By the time she finished reading, her hands had gone cold. Richard Carter, along with Vanessa Carter, was formally contesting the will. The language was polished and clinical, stripped of emotion. Claims of undue influence, questions about Eleanor Brooks's mental capacity, concerns over Evelyn's lack of experience and emotional involvement. Every word was designed to sound reasonable, compassionate even, while dismantling her authority line by line. Evelyn sat at the dining table and read it again. So this was the move. Richard hadn't rushed the courtroom. He'd waited. Let rumors soften the ground. Let doubt spread. And now, with his debts tightening around him, he was striking hard and publicly, forcing her into a fight she couldn't avoid. Her phone buzzed before she could even reach for it. Lucas didn't bother with greetings. They filed, he said. Emergency hearing requested. I know, Evelyn replied. Her voice surprised her. It was steady. Too steady. He's framing this as protection, Lucas continued, for the estate, for you. Evelyn let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course he is. By afternoon, the impact was already spreading. A booking inquiry withdrew. An email from a local bank requested clarification on ownership documents. Even the tone of messages from town had shifted, cautious and distant. Richard was doing what he did best, forcing people to choose sides without ever saying his name. That evening, Vanessa called. Evelyn stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. You didn't have to let it get this far, Vanessa said softly. Dad's under a lot of pressure. We could still fix this quietly. By taking control? Evelyn asked. By being realistic, Vanessa replied. You don't belong in court. He does. The words landed exactly as intended. Old doubt. Old hierarchy. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. You're not worried about me, she said. You're worried about what happens when he loses. There was a pause. Too long. Vanessa hung up without another word. Later that night, Evelyn walked the porch alone, the wind colder than it had been days before. The lodge lights glowed behind her, warm and steady, a sharp contrast to the storm gathering ahead. Richard had officially declared war, and as fear tried to rise again, Evelyn felt something else pushing back, an unshakable certainty that he wouldn't be able to control how this ended. Because this time, the truth wasn't on his side, and neither was time. From the outside, Cedar Ridge looked unchanged. Guests arrived on schedule. Cars crunched along the gravel drive. Laughter drifted across the lawn in the evenings. Evelyn made coffee, checked rooms, fixed a loose railing, and smiled at people who had no idea a legal clock was ticking behind her eyes. Inside, everything had split in two. By day, she was the owner, calm, present, attentive. She greeted families, answered questions, and moved through the lodge with a practiced ease that surprised even her. The routine steadied her. Folding linens, reviewing reservations, listening to guests talk about anniversaries and quiet mornings. Normal life became armor. By night, she became something else. After the last lights went out, Evelyn spread documents across the dining table and worked in silence. Medical records, emails, old calendars in her grandmother's handwriting. Every detail mattered now, every date, every signature. Lucas joined her most nights, laptop open, glasses pushed up his nose, translating emotion into timelines and risk into probability. "He's going to argue confusion," Lucas said quietly one evening, that Eleanor didn't fully understand what she signed. Evelyn didn't look up. She knew exactly what she was doing. "I know," he said. "We just have to prove it to people who never met her." That was the hardest part. Defending someone who could no longer speak for herself. As the days passed, pressure pressed in from all sides. A local paper requested comment. A supplier asked for reassurance. A distant cousin sent a thinly veiled warning about family reputation. Each interaction chipped away at her energy, testing how long she could hold the line without cracking. One night, near midnight, Evelyn paused at the window and stared out at the dark ridge beyond the porch. Doubt crept in, quiet and persuasive. What if she lost? What if Richard dragged this out until the lodge bled dry? What if standing her ground cost her everything? Lucas watched her from across the table. "You don't have to win fast," he said gently. "You just have to win clean." Evelyn nodded, breathing through the fear until it settled. This wasn't a sprint, it was endurance. Richard was betting she'd break first, that exhaustion would do what intimidation no longer could. He didn't see the truth taking shape in the quiet hours, the evidence stacking higher with every night she refused to sleep. By the end of the week, Evelyn understood something fundamental. She wasn't juggling two lives. She was forging one, strong enough to survive both. And that terrified the man who had always depended on her being small. The discovery happened by accident, which somehow made it feel more deliberate. Evelyn had been sorting through a locked cabinet in her grandmother's study, a narrow room most guests never noticed. Inside were tax folders, old maps, and stacks of yellowed notebooks. At the very back, behind a row of outdated insurance binders, she found a small padded envelope with her name written on it in familiar, careful handwriting. Evelyn froze. She sat down slowly, the envelope resting in her lap like something fragile. For a long moment, she didn't open it. She already felt the weight of it, the intention behind it. Eleanor Brooks had never been careless. If this was hidden, it was meant to be found only when everything else failed. Inside was a flash drive and a folded note. "If you're watching this, it means Richard tried to take what he didn't earn. I'm sorry you had to hear my voice this way, but some truths are easier said when the room can't interrupt." Evelyn's throat tightened. Lucas watched silently as she plugged the drive into her laptop. The screen flickered, then resolved into a familiar image. Eleanor sat at the same dining table where Evelyn now worked night after night. Her hair was thinner, her shoulders more fragile, but her eyes were sharp, unmistakably present. "I am of sound mind," Eleanor said calmly, "and I want this recorded because my son believes confidence sounds like truth." Evelyn covered her mouth as tears blurred her vision. Eleanor spoke plainly about Richard pressuring her to refinance the lodge, about his impatience, about the way he talked about unlocking value while ignoring the people who loved the place. She named dates, conversations, exact words. She explained why she structured the will the way she did. "I am not punishing anyone," Eleanor said. "I am protecting what I built and who I trust." Lucas exhaled slowly. "This changes everything." Evelyn shook her head, overwhelmed. He said she was confused. Eleanor smiled faintly on the screen. Confusion is forgetting names, not recognizing greed. When the video ended, the room felt impossibly quiet. The lodge seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn closed the laptop with trembling hands. This wasn't just evidence, it was testimony. A voice Richard could no longer talk over, a truth he couldn't intimidate. For the first time since the lawsuit was filed, Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not in fear, but in strength. Richard had built his entire case on silencing the dead. He had no idea she had already spoken, and this time, the truth was recorded, undeniable, and ready to be heard by everyone he thought would never question him. The moment Eleanor's video existed, the battle changed shape. Richard didn't know it yet, but his confidence began to fracture the very next morning. He arrived at the emergency hearing preparation meeting with his lawyers carrying the same relaxed authority he always wore. But now it felt forced, slightly off-tempo, like a man repeating lines from an old script that no longer fit the room. Evelyn wasn't there, and that unsettled him more than he expected. Across town, she sat with Lucas and her attorney, watching the video again, not for emotion this time, but for precision. Dates, phrases, intent. Every sentence Eleanor spoke dismantled a pillar of Richard's argument. Undue influence, mental decline, emotional manipulation, all of it collapsed under her calm clarity. "He's going to pivot," the attorney said quietly. "When people like him lose one narrative, they don't retreat, they redirect." And Richard did exactly that. Within 48 hours, a new version of events began circulating. He stopped calling Eleanor confused. Instead, he called her misled. He suggested she had been pressured by legal advisors, that Evelyn was not malicious, just misguided, that the lawsuit was about restoring balance, not control. The softer the language became, the more dangerous it was. Evelyn felt it when she read the statements, the way he framed himself as reasonable, protective, burdened by responsibility. It was a performance she knew too well, the same one he used when she was a teenager and disagreed with him. Calm voice, open palms, a suggestion that resistance itself was proof of instability. Lucas shook his head as he scrolled through the filings. "He's bleeding," he said, "and he knows it." "How?" Evelyn asked. "He's distancing himself from the money," Lucas replied. "Talking values, legacy. That's what people do when the numbers stop working in their favor." The pressure showed elsewhere, too. Richard's lenders began asking questions, quiet ones, emails that demanded clarification. Calls returned later than promised. His financial timeline was tightening, even if no one said it out loud yet. Evelyn stood by the window, watching clouds roll in over the ridge. For weeks, she had been reacting, defending, absorbing, enduring. Now, for the first time, she felt ahead of him, not triumphant, focused. Richard was still dangerous, still capable of damage, but his greatest weapon, absolute control over the story, was slipping through his fingers. And as his mask cracked, Evelyn understood something vital. This wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about letting him expose himself, one carefully chosen lie at a time. Margaret Hale arrived at Cedar Ridge just after dusk, her car pulling into the drive without headlights, as if she didn't want anyone to notice. Evelyn watched from the porch, a quiet tension settling into her chest. Of all the people involved in this fight, Margaret was the one she understood the least and trusted the least. For years, Margaret had been invisible. She stood beside Richard at events, smiled when required, and stayed silent when his voice filled the room. Evelyn had learned not to expect anything from her. Silence, after all, was its own kind of loyalty. Margaret stepped out of the car slowly, smoothing her coat with trembling hands. She looked smaller than Evelyn remembered, older, as if the strain of the past weeks had finally begun to show. "I didn't tell him I was coming," Margaret said quietly once they were inside. Evelyn nodded, saying nothing. They sat across from each other at the dining table, the same place Eleanor's video had been recorded. For a long moment, Margaret stared at the wood grain, tracing a line with her finger, as though grounding herself. "He's in trouble," she said at last, "more than he's admitting." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "I know." Margaret swallowed. "No, you don't know everything." She lifted her eyes then, and the fear in them was unmistakable. Richard borrowed against the lodge long before your grandmother passed. Not officially, of course, but he promised access, control. He told investors the will would be corrected. Evelyn felt a sharp inhale catch in her throat. He used my name, Margaret continued, put accounts in joint filings, said it was temporary. I didn't understand what I was agreeing to until it was too late. Lucas, standing quietly near the doorway, stiffened. "Why are you telling me this now?" Evelyn asked. Margaret's voice wavered. "Because he's pushing me to lie, under oath. He wants me to say Eleanor was confused, that she didn't know what she was signing." Silence filled the room. "I can't do it," Margaret whispered. "I've lived too long being quiet, and if I go down with him, I want it to be for telling the truth." Evelyn studied her face, searching for calculation, for manipulation. She found none. Only exhaustion, fear, and something else, relief. "You understand what this means," Evelyn said carefully. "If you testify, he'll never forgive you." Margaret let out a hollow laugh. He stopped forgiving people the moment they stopped obeying him. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, steady and patient. In that moment, Evelyn realized this was the turn she hadn't planned for. Not evidence, not strategy, a human fracture. Richard had built his power on silence. And now, the one person he assumed would never speak was finally ready to break it. The courtroom felt colder than Evelyn expected, despite the crowded benches and steady murmur of voices. Fluorescent lights washed everything in pale clarity, leaving no room for shadows. Every movement seemed amplified. The scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers, the controlled breathing of people who knew they were being watched. Richard Carter sat at the plaintiff's table in a tailored dark suit, posture flawless, expression carefully composed. To anyone who didn't know him, he looked like a man carrying an unbearable weight with dignity. The grieving son, the responsible patriarch, the only adult in a room full of emotion. Evelyn recognized the act instantly. She sat beside her attorney, hands folded, spine straight, refusing to let the room intimidate her. Lucas sat behind her, quiet and alert, eyes moving constantly. Across the aisle, Vanessa avoided her gaze entirely. Richard's attorney spoke first, voice smooth and confident. He painted Eleanor Brooks as a woman deeply devoted to her granddaughter, perhaps too devoted. He suggested that love, combined with age, had clouded her judgment, that Evelyn, though well-meaning, lacked the experience to manage a valuable property responsibly. Every sentence sounded reasonable, almost compassionate. Then Richard took the stand. He spoke of family legacy, of responsibility, of regret. He described his heartbreak when Evelyn distanced herself years ago, careful to avoid the word disowned. He spoke about wanting to protect his mother's wishes, about fearing that outsiders had influenced her during a vulnerable time. At one point, he even looked at Evelyn and said softly, "I just want my daughter to be safe." A murmur rippled through the room. Evelyn felt her jaw tighten, but kept her face neutral. This was his strength, turning cruelty into concern, control into care. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. When cross-examination began, the tone shifted. Dates were introduced, loan documents, email chains that contradicted his testimony. The calm confidence in Richard's voice began to falter as questions narrowed. His answers grew longer, less precise. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat. Finally, Evelyn's attorney asked, "Mr. Carter, did you secure financial agreements based on the assumption that you would gain control of the Cedar Ridge Lodge?" Richard hesitated, just long enough. In that pause, Evelyn saw it, the crack beneath the performance, the realization that this stage wasn't bending to him the way rooms always had before. For the first time, Richard Carter wasn't commanding the narrative. He was reacting to it. And as the judge leaned forward, eyes sharp with interest, Evelyn understood that the act he'd perfected over decades was beginning to fail under the weight of facts he could no longer talk his way around. The courtroom shifted when Margaret Hale was called to the stand. It wasn't dramatic at first, no gasps, no whispers, just a subtle tightening in the air, the kind that comes when people sense something irreversible is about to happen. Evelyn watched Margaret walk forward slowly, her steps careful, as if each one required permission she had never given herself before. Richard didn't look at her. That, more than anything, told Evelyn how much this moment mattered. Margaret sat, folded her hands, and swore the oath in a voice that trembled only slightly. When she looked up, her eyes were glossy but clear, not confused, not hesitant, determined. The attorney's questions began gently. How long had she known Eleanor Brooks? How often had they spoken in the final years? Margaret answered simply, precisely. She described Sunday visits, long conversations, shared meals. She spoke of Eleanor's sharp memory, her opinions, her frustration with being underestimated. Then the questions turned. Did Eleanor ever express confusion about her estate? The attorney asked. Margaret inhaled slowly. No. Richard shifted in his seat. She was very clear, Margaret continued, clear about what she wanted and why. Richard's lawyer stood abruptly. Objection. Overruled, the judge said. The witness may continue. Margaret's voice grew steadier with each word. She spoke about Richard's pressure, about conversations she overheard, about his insistence on refinancing, on expanding, on turning the lodge into leverage. She admitted her own silence, her fear of confrontation, her regret. Then came the question that changed everything. Mrs. Hale, the attorney said, did Mr. Carter ever discuss his financial expectations regarding the lodge before the will was read? Margaret looked directly at Richard for the first time. Yes, she said. He told me the lodge would be his within months, that the will would be challenged and corrected. A ripple moved through the courtroom. Richard finally turned toward her, his expression sharp, warning. Margaret, he said under his breath. She flinched, but she didn't stop. He used the lodge as collateral in conversations with investors. She continued. He assumed control before it was legally his. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes, not from victory, but from witnessing something rarer. Margaret wasn't just testifying, she was reclaiming herself. When Margaret stepped down, she didn't look back at Richard. She walked past him as if he were already part of a life she had left behind. In that moment, Evelyn understood the truth. This case was no longer about property. It was about what happens when control finally meets courage and loses. The courtroom fell into a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if everyone inside understood they were standing at the edge of something final. The judge leaned back in his chair, reviewing his notes one last time, eyes moving slowly across the pages that had dismantled years of carefully crafted control. Evelyn held her breath without realizing it. Richard sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped too tightly, jaw locked. The confidence that had carried him through the morning was gone now, replaced by a strained stillness. He didn't look at Evelyn. He stared straight ahead, as if refusing to acknowledge the possibility that this room no longer belonged to him. The judge cleared his throat. After reviewing the testimony, documentation, and recorded evidence, he began, this court finds no basis to support the claim that Eleanor Brooks lacked mental capacity at the time her will was executed. Evelyn felt Lucas's hand settle briefly against her shoulder. She didn't move. The evidence demonstrates consistent intent, sound judgment, and a clear understanding of the consequences of her decisions. The judge continued. Therefore, the petition to contest the will is denied in full. The words echoed, sharp and unmistakable. Richard's lawyer lowered his gaze. Vanessa's face drained of color. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, he said, this court finds that the plaintiffs pursued this action with foreknowledge of financial risk tied to anticipated control of the Cedar Ridge Lodge. As such, all court costs and legal fees are to be borne by Richard Carter and Vanessa Carter. For a moment, Richard didn't react at all. Then his composure fractured. He exhaled sharply, one hand gripping the edge of the table as if to steady himself. The mask, so carefully maintained, collapsed in a single breath. Evelyn saw it clearly now. Not anger, not grief, but panic. This wasn't just a legal loss, it was exposure. The judge's gavel struck once, clean and final. Court is adjourned. As people stood and voices returned in low, stunned murmurs, Evelyn remained seated. The room blurred slightly as the weight of the moment settled in. She had won, but not through force or cruelty, through truth, patience, and refusing to bend. Richard finally turned toward her. Their eyes met across the aisle. For the first time in her life, he looked small. Evelyn rose, smoothing her jacket, and walked past him without a word. She didn't need one. The verdict had said everything he never wanted to hear, and everything she had spent 10 years proving was true. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It never does. At first, it came quietly, in the form of unanswered calls and delayed replies. Richard left the courthouse surrounded by people, but within days, the circle began to thin. His lawyer stopped returning messages after business hours. Investors who once demanded meetings suddenly claimed to be traveling. Lenders asked for updated documents, then followed with firmer requests. Then came the word Richard feared most: payment. Without control of Cedar Ridge, the numbers no longer worked. The short-term loans he had taken, confident they would be refinanced once the lodge became his, started coming due. Interest compounded fast, unforgiving and exact. He tried to negotiate. He always had. But confidence without collateral sounded different. Thin. Desperate. Vanessa was the first to panic. Evelyn heard about it through town gossip and quiet confirmations. Vanessa sold her luxury car within a week. Then came the listing of a downtown condo she'd once bragged about at family events. The emails she had sent mocking Evelyn's sentimental attachment now looked painfully short-sighted. Richard fought longer. He sold assets he never thought he'd have to touch, liquidated investments he'd once called untouchable. Each sale was framed as a strategic move, but the truth leaked anyway. People noticed. Whispers followed him into rooms where doors once opened automatically. The most telling moment came 3 weeks after the verdict. Richard stood alone outside a bank branch, phone pressed to his ear, voice raised just enough for passers-by to hear the strain beneath his anger. Evelyn wasn't there, but she could picture it perfectly. The rigid posture, the clenched jaw, the disbelief that the world had not bent back into place. Control had always been his currency. Now it was gone. Margaret moved out quietly. No announcements, no confrontations, just one suitcase and a signed lease across town. When asked later why she left, she simply said, "I chose peace." Evelyn returned to Cedar Ridge that evening and walked the grounds as the sun set behind the trees. The lodge stood unchanged, solid against the fading light. Children laughed near the fire pit. A couple leaned together on the porch, unaware of the quiet justice unfolding far from their view. Richard lost everything he gambled, not because Evelyn destroyed him, but because he had built his power on an assumption that finally failed. As the night settled in, Evelyn understood something deeply satisfying and strangely calm. This was what accountability looked like. No shouting, no revenge, just consequences, arriving exactly on time. When the noise finally faded, the quiet felt unfamiliar. For weeks, Evelyn had lived inside urgency, documents, deadlines, strategy, survival. Now there were no hearings to prepare for, no threats arriving in envelopes, no late-night calls that tightened her chest before she answered. The absence of crisis left space behind, and space demanded to be filled. She found it in the mornings. Evelyn began waking early before guests stirred, carrying a mug of coffee onto the porch, while the valley below slowly caught the light. The lodge breathed differently at dawn, softer, honest. She watched mist lift from the trees and felt something inside her unclench, little by little. Lucas stayed. Not as a savior, not as a hero, just present. They worked side by side without forcing anything, reviewing bookings, fixing what needed fixing, sharing meals that didn't need conversation to feel full. In the evenings, they walked the grounds together, talking about small things, movies they'd missed, places they still wanted to see, the ordinary future that had once felt unreachable. One night, Evelyn admitted something she hadn't said out loud before. "I thought winning would feel louder," she said quietly. Lucas smiled. "Loud endings are for people who need to be seen." She considered that. "What about this?" "This," he said, gesturing toward the lodge, the darkening sky, the calm settling between them, is for people who need to breathe. Healing didn't arrive as forgiveness. Evelyn didn't suddenly feel compassion for Richard or regret for the distance between them. What arrived instead was clarity. She no longer replayed conversations in her head. She no longer imagined better versions of a father who had never chosen to be one. The past stopped asking for her attention. Late one afternoon, Evelyn found herself in her grandmother's study again, opening a book she'd read years earlier and never finished. She smiled at the margin notes Eleanor had left behind, sharp observations, gentle humor, reminders to trust her instincts. This, Evelyn realized, was the inheritance, not just property, not justice, freedom. That night, Lucas reached for her hand without ceremony, without promise. She didn't pull away. She didn't rush forward either. She let the moment exist exactly as it was, safe, unclaimed, real. For the first time in her life, Evelyn understood that healing wasn't about erasing pain. It was about choosing what deserved space in the life that came after it. Evelyn never imagined getting married at Cedar Ridge. For most of her life, the idea of a wedding had felt distant, almost fictional, something meant for people who came from stable families, people whose pasts didn't echo so loudly. Yet on a quiet autumn afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the trees and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and fallen leaves, the lodge transformed into something softer. There were no grand announcements, no elaborate planning, just a decision made one evening on the porch, spoken aloud without ceremony. "What if we did it here?" Lucas had asked gently. Evelyn looked around, taking in the view, the place that had carried her through loss, battle, and recovery. She thought of her grandmother, of the promise embedded in every beam and floorboard. "Yes," she said, and meant it. The wedding was small, intentionally so. A handful of guests, friends who had stood by her when she had nothing, locals who had come to trust her stewardship, a few families staying at the lodge who were invited without obligation. There was no aisle, just a clearing near the ridge, chairs arranged in a loose semicircle, the valley stretching endlessly behind them. Evelyn wore a simple dress, unadorned and light. She walked in alone, not out of defiance, but out of choice. Each step felt steady, grounded. This wasn't about being given away. It was about arriving. Lucas waited for her without nerves or performance. When he reached for her hands, his touch was familiar, reassuring. The vows they exchanged were quiet, unpolished, spoken like promises meant to be kept in ordinary moments rather than dramatic ones. "I choose you," Evelyn said, her voice clear, "not because I need saving, but because I want a life built with honesty." "I choose you," Lucas replied, "not to fix you, but to stand with you." There were no speeches, no expectations. Laughter drifted easily through the gathering. Children ran across the grass. Someone played music softly from a speaker on the porch. The lodge seemed to watch, patient and approving. As evening fell, Evelyn stood beside Lucas, looking out over Cedar Ridge, and felt something settle deep inside her. She hadn't won a war just to prove she could. She had built a life where love didn't come with conditions, where belonging wasn't fragile, and where the future no longer felt like something she had to earn. This was her reward, not revenge, not validation, but a beginning she chose freely, surrounded by peace she fought to protect. Life at Cedar Ridge didn't slow after the wedding. It softened. Morning still arrived early, with sunlight spilling across the porch and the quiet rhythm of guests waking one by one. Evelyn learned that peace wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It showed up in small, repeatable moments. Coffee shared in silence, laughter drifting from the yard, the steady knowledge that no one was waiting to take what she had built. Sometimes, though, a question returned. It surfaced when she passed the old driveway in town, when she heard someone mention Richard's name in a hushed, cautious tone, when she caught her reflection late at night and saw not the frightened girl from years ago, but a woman shaped by choices she had survived. What if he had chosen differently? Evelyn didn't ask the question with bitterness anymore. It came without heat, without accusation, just curiosity, a quiet wondering about parallel lives that never happened. What if Richard had opened the door instead of closing it? What if family had meant protection instead of control? What if love had been offered freely, without conditions? The answers didn't matter. That was the realization that surprised her most. Standing on the porch one evening, watching Lucas laugh with guests near the fire pit, Evelyn understood something essential. Closure didn't come from rewriting the past. It came from no longer needing it to explain the present. Richard lived somewhere else now, smaller spaces, quieter rooms, a life narrowed by the very leverage he once relied on. Evelyn didn't follow the details. She didn't need to. Consequences had done their work without her supervision. Inside the lodge, a new guest book sat open on the front desk. Fresh pages filled quickly with notes, gratitude, memories, promises to return. Evelyn flipped through them occasionally, smiling at the ordinary magic of it all. This was the legacy Eleanor Brooks had protected. Not money alone, not land, but choice. The choice to stay, the choice to leave, the choice to build something honest and let it stand on its own strength. Later that night, Evelyn and Lucas walked the ridge trail under a sky crowded with stars. He slipped his hand into hers without asking. She squeezed back, steady and sure. "I used to think surviving was the hardest part," Evelyn said quietly. Lucas glanced at her. "What changed?" "Now I know," she replied. "The hardest part is believing you deserve what comes after." They stopped, looking out over Cedar Ridge one last time before heading inside. The lodge lights glowed warmly against the dark, unwavering. Evelyn didn't look back with regret. She looked forward, rooted, chosen, and finally free. So, the story has come to an end. And if you're still here with me right now, truly still here, then something in this journey touched you in a quiet but real way. Evelyn's story isn't just about inheritance, betrayal, or even justice. It's about a truth many of us learn the hard way. You don't heal by winning against others. You heal by standing firmly in who you are. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Evelyn didn't control her past, her father, or the damage done to her. What she controlled was her response, and that changed everything. Stoicism teaches us that pain doesn't disappear, but it loses its power when we stop letting it define us. Another Stoic truth reminds us, the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. And that's exactly what happened here. Not through anger, but through integrity, patience, and quiet resilience. If this story resonated with you, if it reflected a chapter of your own life, then you're not alone. Stories like this remind us that healing is possible, dignity can be reclaimed, and peace is something we can choose. If you felt that, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel. Your presence here matters more than you know.